Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. As usual, my name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education here at the Westport Museum. Thank you so much for joining me. This is our weekly Tuesday Treasure program where I go through some of the lesser-seen objects in the museum's collection to just show you all some of the items that we'd like to highlight that you might not see very often. As always, our program is provided here for free. Thank you so much for joining me. We do, of course, always ask that you support the museum however you can. We have a suggested donation of $5, but we understand this is a difficult time. You can also support the museum by following us and liking us on social media. On our Facebook and Twitter accounts, you can follow and like us at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. During our program, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment bar. I am monitoring those, and I will try to get as many of those answered or addressed at the end of our program tonight. If you think of something after our program that you didn't think of while we were here live, please still leave a comment or a question. I'm always monitoring these videos, and I will do my best to get back to you with any answers that I might have. So tonight we are going to talk a bit about the Westport Sanitariums, and there were two of them. I hope you will notice with the sign behind me, which we will address in just a little bit. So, first of all, sanitariums were first created in Europe. Some of the very first sanitariums were in Germany, and they were created to treat those that were afflicted with tuberculosis. There was a belief at the time that the cool, fresh mountain air that many of the sanitariums were built in would have a restorative effect on those who were being afflicted by tuberculosis. They also had the idea of rest as a form of treatment. There weren't a lot of treatments for tuberculosis at the time, and they believed that, again, that cool, refreshing mountain air would do a lot for the system and act as a kind of natural restorative element. Later in the 19th century, towards the end of the century, sanitariums come over to the United States, and some of them do treat tuberculosis. There's actually a directory that is sent out around the country. I believe that it is a nationwide directory in 1904 and 1906 that talks about different sanitariums and the ailments that they treat. Now, in Westport, we had two sanitariums. One was the Westport Sanitarium, very easy to remember, and then also Dr. Mcfarland's Sanitarium. Both of these institutions were private institutions, and that meant you had to pay to be there. Both of them also treated what they called nervous diseases, what they called insanity, hysteria, and other afflictions of that type. They also treated what they called, or they believed their institution was a place to be cured of liquor, tobacco, and drug habits. And that's actually listed in the directory in 1906 for both of these institutions. So first we're going to start with the Westport Sanitarium. Prior to being the sanitarium itself, it was on the property of what was the home of State Senator Richard Henry Winslow. And this is a property that sits, today we would know that it sits at the corner of Post Road and Campo Road. So this was the home of Richard Henry Winslow, and it's nicknamed the Winslow Mansion. It is a very lavish building, and it's built in 1853. Once Mr. Winslow passes away, the property stays in his family until it is sold in 1891. And it's actually sold directly to Dr. Ruland, Dr. Frederick D. Ruland, for what is listed as the treatment of the mentally ill. One of the first items, I will tell you down so you can see, one of the first items that I'd like to show you tonight is a pamphlet from the Westport Sanitarium. Now, this is not the actual pamphlet, part of the reason I'm not wearing my gloves. This is a reproduction. So this is a print of a scan of the original document. Now, this pamphlet, though undated, we know from the typeset and some of the names that appear on the pamphlet itself, is from the early 20th century, so probably circa 1905 or so. One of the things that I like to point out on this pamphlet, this is the cover here, the logo, the name, as well as the city, and then the back cover here, it shows this picture, and it is captioned, "The view from the main house." So this is the picture that patients would have been seeing if they were in the Winslow Mansion and looking out. It's a really lovely view. On the inside of the pamphlet, which I'll show you as well, it has two more pictures. So this is the Winslow house, the Winslow Mansion, and this is what they consider to be the main house. The other picture is of the, and I'll turn it a little bit so you can see a little bit better. There we are. There's a fountain in the front here, and then in the back you can actually see the main sanitarium building, and that is where most patients would have been housed. I believe there were 70 beds in the main building. The other thing that this pamphlet discusses is the over 100 or nearly 100 acres that are on the property that, and you can see it on the back side here, that is being used for occupation and amenities here. One of the things that the 100 acres was being used for were beautiful, beautiful gardens that patients, again, the idea of rest and work, they could enjoy these gardens, but then also work in some of the farms that were on the property. So taking a bit of a rest within the gardens itself, being able to relax, quiet their minds, but then also being industrious and staying busy while also supporting the sanitarium. Some of the items that were farmed on the property were also put on the table afterwards. This pamphlet also has a section on the inside where it addresses physicians. You can see it just, sorry, it's backwards on my screen here. You can see it here, to physicians, where they actually are using this pamphlet to market to other physicians about sending their patients to the Westport Sanitarium. So this would have been something that was used probably in other doctors' offices and hospitals, but also with private families to try and entice them to have their relatives treated at the sanitarium. The second piece that I wanted to show you is also another scan, but this is of a photograph, and this is a colorized photograph. The original is a black and white, and these are some of the nurses that worked at the Westport Sanitarium. And while we don't know the names of any of these women, it's really interesting to be able to see the people that worked in this institution. This is taken in a barn that we believe was on the property. And you can see that they're women of all different ages, but it's really just lovely to see just an image of some of the people who were making this institution run. Other treatments that were employed at the sanitarium included shock therapy, hydrotherapy. They did have also psychotherapy and what they called vapor baths. Those are the treatments that are listed within the pamphlet for the Westport Sanitarium, but that's also the typical treatments that they would have seen at other institutions as well. We know that Dr. David Walter Mcfarland opened his own sanitarium in Westport 7 years later in 1898, and he opened Mcfarland Sanitarium in Greens Farms. Now, we know just the year prior, 1897, that the Westport Sanitarium and Dr. Ruland had received an institute certificate giving permission to set up and operate a sanitarium in Westport. It's actually signed by Lauren A. Cook, who was the Connecticut governor at the time. It was basically a license to operate. Thus far, we have not been able to find the same kind of paperwork for Mcfarland Sanitarium, so it brings in a bit of a strange history for this institution. The other curious part is Mcfarland's is listed in the town census, but it is listed as a private rented residence and any individuals living there as inmates. So we can see that it is being run as a mental institution. We see it in again, the directories in 1904 and in 1906, but we don't see the legality of setting up such an institution, and we don't see it listed as a business. So it raises some issues with the validity of that institution. But we do know that both Mcfarland and Ruland were licensed doctors. We also know that they both belonged to the Connecticut Society of Alienists. And alienist is just a 19th and 20th century term for a psychiatrist. We know that they both belonged to this society, and we know that they at least knew each other professionally. In 1910, Mcfarland of Mcfarland Sanitarium served as president of the society, and Dr. Ruland served under him as the treasurer. So we know that they at least were aware of each other. While in the Connecticut Society of Alienists, they both also supported legislation to reform the care and restoration of those nervously imbalanced, as they called it. One thing that I thought I might show you from what Mcfarland's would become was Holbrook Sanitarium. Now, this crate is slightly misspelled. It does say Holbrooks instead of Holbrook, but this is the same property and many of the same buildings that were operated as Mcfarland Sanitarium just previously. So this is just after Mcfarland retires. I believe this is actually after his son-in-law has been running the sanitarium. But this crate is it's a shipping lid, and we can see very clearly Holbrook Sanitarium in Greens Farms, Connecticut. We also see some of the other labels over here. There's a Railway Express label that is being sent from New York. And then there is another label down here also from the railroad. But the most interesting one is down here from H.W. Baker Linen Company. So this is, it's also labeled 168 pounds. So we believe that this is linens being sent to the sanitarium either for clothing, bed linens, curtains, something like that, table linens. But this is one of the few objects that we still have and that has been around town of Mcfarland's and later Holbrook Sanitarium. There's much more material for the Westport Sanitarium. I'm not sure the reason why, but it is a curious thing. So this is one of the few items that still exists from Mcfarland's or Holbrook Sanitarium. Neither one of these institutions were known for a history of mistreatment. They were both regarded as good institutions at the cutting edge of mental illness, what they would have called insanity and the treatment of the insane during their time. There were actually reports of evaluators coming in and finding both institutions to be very good. But we do know that both organizations were named in legal cases throughout their operation. Both were charged in separate cases of false imprisonment as well as negligence, but none of these cases ever went through. Unfortunately, many of the cases that come through these institutions are of people who are mentally ill, and many times their family or the individual themselves would not understand the details of their case. it is still interesting to think about whether any of these allegations are true, just because it is during the 20th century and there was a bit more, there is a bit more area of gray during that time period. So while they were never found guilty of any of these, they were very frequently in court facing some of these allegations. One of the other items I thought I would show you, and I am going to put my gloves on for this, this item is not something that was used, or this item is not from one of the sanitariums, but this is a bottle. This is a glass bottle. This is a chloroform bottle. You can actually see over here on this side there is a skull and crossbones, and then you can read quite clearly that it says chloroform across the label there, and it does warn on the second line there, poison. Now this bottle was, let me adjust this so you can see it a bit more. This bottle was labeled and sold by the Westport Drug Company, which is on the lowest level of what is today Tokay Hall. It was a storefront there during the 20th century. Now, chloroform was used during the 19th century mostly as an anesthetic for surgical procedures. It actually peaked during the Civil War when it was used during many of the operations there. It continued through the mid-1900s before it was deemed too toxic and volatile to be used. And while we know that neither sanitarium was performing surgeries, chloroform would have been something present in those institutions as a way to sedate or control what they would call difficult patients. There are cases of violence in the sanitariums, and this might have been used to sedate and also knock out some of those violent episodes to keep order. Another item that I wanted to show you is from the 1920s, when both sanitariums are still in operation. During the 1920s, there was a health craze. People were very, very conscious of getting exercise and trying to take natural supplements, and this is one of the things that they might have found. Now, this is a tin sign. It's an advertisement sign for Fleischmann's yeast. And Charles Fleischmann was a European immigrant with distillery skills, and he partnered with James Gaff, and they formed what was the Fleischmann Distilling Company, where they produced gin. In the gin process, you of course have to use yeast, and rather than throwing away the leftover yeast or letting it go to waste, they decided they would dry it and press it into blocks just like you see over here on this side. Now, these blocks of yeast were sold by their second company, Fleischmann's Company, and it was an edible yeast cake. This isn't something that you would make bread out of, as we all have been doing in the last couple of weeks. This is something that either would have been put into another recipe as almost like a supplement, or the cake itself would have been eaten as a snack. Now, I have seen many accounts of people who have tried these cakes or used to eat these cakes as a kind of vitamin or a supplement, and it does not seem that these yeast cakes are very tasty. So, but it is something that would have been available to everyday Westporters to try and promote their own health. So during the 1900s, both of these sanitariums were operating. It's not until the 1960s that we see these institutions starting to either morph into hospitals and other organizations, or they are reducing in number. We know that the Westport Sanitarium with Dr. Ruland closed in 1967. 2 years later, it was sold to Dr. Walter Langendorf, who was an Austrian chemist, and he was actually the owner of the Evian perfume company. Within about a year to a year and a half, the property was sold to the town of Westport, and at that point, and before that actually, towards the end of the life of the sanitarium itself, the buildings had begun to deteriorate and fall into a really poor condition. It is known to many longtime Westporters that this building stood in what is today Winslow Park, and that people could be found squatting in the building, that it was not very safe. In 1971, unfortunately, the buildings could not be saved, and they were demolished by H&S Dump Trucking of Norwalk. While we don't have the buildings anymore, we do still find some artifacts. This is one artifact that was found in 2019 and was very generously donated to the museum. And this is an electroplated silver spoon. And if you look very carefully, make sure I have it right side up, it is quite hard to see, but if you look on the handle of the spoon, you can see just here, again, it might be a little difficult to see, but you can see engraved the words Westport Sanitarium. This is a spoon that would have been used by the patients in the institution. Again, understanding this is a private hospital or sanitarium, where people would have been accustomed to private nurses, private rooms, and very fine cutlery as well. So this is one object that was found on the grounds of the sanitarium and is still with us today. So there are still some small pieces of the sanitarium left on the grounds of Winslow Park, and today many Westporters know of it as the dog park. So if you go walking, keep your eye out and let us know if you find anything. We are always looking to add to our collection of Westport-related objects. Today the park is, of course, owned by the town, and it is operated for the public. For Mcfarland Sanitarium, after his retirement, Dr. McFarland's son-in-law, Frederick H. Jones, operated the sanitarium until 1948. Sometime after 1948, the sanitarium was renamed Holbrook, or misspelled Holbrook Sanitarium, where it operated for quite some time. In the year 1964, it actually fell under the administration of Elizabeth F.S. Solomon. Now, the last piece that I want to present to you is actually not something that you can see. It's something that I'm going to read to you, and it's about Miss Solomon. In 1966, Holbrook Sanitarium is actually changed into a nonprofit foundation or nonprofit organization called the Holbrook Foundation. So Holbrook is no longer a sanitarium. It is now a nonprofit foundation, still under the leadership of Elizabeth Solomon. Many of the employees find issue with her managerial style. There is actually a very long article that's written in Westport about Elizabeth Solomon and what they called her dictatorial regime or dictatorial managerial style, and there were many complaints launched against her throughout the 60s and 70s until in 1980 she was actually removed as the foundation's administrator as well as its board of directors, which she sat on as a voting member. Now, we come across a very strange incident with Elizabeth Solomon after she has been removed from the foundation, and we find this strange situation through the official proceedings of the Connecticut Supreme Court in the 1990s. And I thought I would read to you just a bit of the official decision that was typed up after the proceedings. Quote, in the early morning hours of February 17, 1982, Solomon seized physical control of Holbrook, accompanied by uniformed guards, then ensconced herself in the administrative offices and made announcements on Holbrook's public address system, transmitting through the institution to patients as well as staff, telling everyone she was taking over and that no harm would come to anyone. During the course of the day, Solomon gave interviews and issued press releases distributed to newspapers, radio stations, and television stations, announcing that she was resuming the executive directorship. Meanwhile, Solomon's security guards posted themselves at Holbrook's gates, accompanied by a dog and giving walkie-talkies supplied by Solomon. They stopped and questioned all staff as well as patients and their families. They denied access to a list of employees and Holbrook trustees supplied by Solomon, and distributed purported termination letters from Solomon to 16 employees. Despite repeated requests from various people that she leave, Solomon refused, until finally she was served with a court order requiring her departure. Even then, she would not go until an attorney advised her to do so. After this incident, Solomon was not charged with any kind of charges, but she was awarded rent. Solomon, as well as the main administrator for the foundation and a director on the board of directors, was also the landlord for the foundation, and the court did find that she was owed back rent. And it went a very, very strange situation towards the end of the Holbrook Foundation's life. Holbrook, or the organization that was Holbrook, does still exist. Today it is St. Vincent's Behavioral Health Services, which is now a part of Hartford Healthcare. I hope you enjoyed all of the items that I showed you. If you do have any questions or comments, little anecdotes you would like to share, please do put them in the comment box. I'm going to go through a few of them. We do have a couple over here on the side. Sarah comments that Mr. Winslow, who owned the Winslow Mansion, called the house Campo House, and it was known as the Manor House by Dr. Ruland's family. Fascinating. It does have many, many names, as many places in Westport do. All of the locations have nicknames and official names, and it's always tricky. There is a question here from Susan who asks, what is the thing in the middle of them? Oh, I apologize. I wasn't sure which object you were talking about. I believe that she's referring to the nurses and asking what that object down in the center is. And I do believe it is a heating element. And actually there is a reply just down below that says, it looks to be a small heating element, possibly for use to sanitize materials in boiling water. And I believe you're correct. It looks like there's a heating element, and there may actually be a small pot or something up on top of the that kind of shelf that they have that they may be sanitizing items in. We have another question. Do we know why Dr. Mcfarland decided to open a second sanitarium in a town that already had one? That is an excellent question, and I have not found the answer for that. Last year, the museum had a small exhibit on both sanitariums in Westport as well as health in the late 19th century and through the 20th century. And despite all of our research into that topic, we could not find much material on Mcfarland's sanitarium. It does seem that Mcfarland, while it was still a private institution, may have catered to a slightly poorer community. He did not cater to the poor, but he may not have been serving as wealthy of clients as the Westport Sanitarium was. We see him offer a free clinic at one point, so it seems like he may have opened his sanitarium as a cheaper choice, but that is purely conjecture, purely looking at the resources that we have available. We would love to find even more resources on both of these institutions to solidify some more of those questions that we have. That is definitely a question that I would love to be able to find the answer for you. It might just require even more time to research into these institutions. So those are all of the questions that I have right now. Again, if you think of any others after this video has been posted, it of course will be on our Facebook page. Please don't hesitate to put another comment down here in the comment bar. Again, we're always looking out to see if there are any new questions or comments. Also this summer, if you are interested in more of the history on the Westport Sanitarium, we will be offering either a virtual or very, very limited social distanced walking tour of Winslow Park to discuss more about Richard Henry Winslow, the original owner of the Campo House, as well as the sanitarium and some of the specific stories of patients and doctors and administrators on that site, as well as the ultimate fate of the sanitarium that was torn down. So definitely check out our website, both of our websites, as well as our Facebook page for that event coming a little bit later this summer. So thank you all for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed looking over all of these items, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.